Welcome to Hashtag Wednesdays Weekly, a weekly training seminar in collaboration with the voluntary and public sector partners. This week, our training is held by Rochdale District Mind on managing your own wellbeing. So welcome Alice Astley and Neil Kerr. Over to you.
Hello, thank you. I'm just going to share the screen. Okay, so thank you for joining us. My name's Alice and this is my colleague Neil, and we're both from Rochdale and District Mind. So we're going to be talking to you today about wellbeing. So this session's going to cover an introduction to managing your wellbeing. We're going to be looking at the vicious cycle of thoughts, feelings and behaviour, and give you some helpful tips in terms of improving your own wellbeing. At the end of the session, we'll show you how to access further intervention from our service if you need it, or if you want to signpost one of your friends, family or someone you work with to the service. I'm going to hand you over to Neil, who's going to look at depression, anxiety and stress.
Thank you, Alice. Hi, everyone. So depression and anxiety affects 1 in 4 of us at any point in our lives. And it affects us in 3 main ways. It affects how we think, it affects how we feel, both emotionally and physiologically, and it affects how we behave, what we do. So with depression, if you look here, it says negative thinking, and this is something that quite often is where it starts, and that's what we're going to look at today when we come to look at the vicious cycle later. So negative thinking is where we get into the style of where everything kind of, seems that it's quite dark, that there's no way out, that that things aren't going to change, things aren't going to improve. And of course, if you're thinking like that, that is going to affect how you feel emotionally and physically as well. And of course, it's going to affect how you're actually behaving. And, that can be things like withdrawing from seeing people, isolating yourself, just losing general interest in everyday life, even things that you used to enjoy doing. And it works very similar with anxiety. Again, the negative thinking. With anxiety, it's quite often prediction. With anxiety, the depression is usually about looking back and rumination, and we do this through a style of thinking called negative focus, which we'll look at a little bit later when we're looking at different styles of thinking. So with depression, it's very much about looking back and very much focus on the bad things that have happened recently or in the past, and discounting the more positive things. They don't matter. They don't. We don't focus on those. And of course, if we're focusing on the bad things, then we start to think about the future and predicting what might happen in the future. It's not going to look good if we're in there, and that's why anxiety and depression are very, very linked. And so with anxiety, again, we do this kind of negative thinking and making predictions. It mentions here on catastrophizing, which is one of the classic, if you like, one of the classic types of negative thinking that we might do. And as I say, we'll look at that in a little bit. So doing this style of thinking, this negative thinking, of course, that will affect us both emotionally and physically. With anxiety, the physical symptoms may be things like, palpitations, feeling nauseous, feeling alert, more on edge. And again, the behavioral change here might be avoiding situations. If I'm thinking something's going to go wrong, if we're thinking, if I go there, this will happen, and we start to feel those emotions and those physical sensations, that's definitely going to be enough to make us go, no, I'm going to avoid that. I'm going to stay at home. I'm not going to go to that party. I'm not going to go for that interview. I'm not going to go and do whatever it is you're meant to be doing. So this is what brings us into what we're going to look at today, which is called the vicious cycle. When is this a problem? Well, I mean, it's quite common and quite natural for us all to feel low and from time to time feel a little bit anxious about something. A job interview, as I just mentioned, a date, a whole range of things can make us just feel anxious. and things can happen that can make us feel low. You know, if this is periodic, it's fine, and it only lasts for a period of time. But what we're talking about here is when the symptoms become persistent. So it's basically where we really notice that this is going on for quite some time, and quite often it's other people that can comment and actually notice these things first. And obviously, if we're going on like this on a long-term basis, our day-to-day life is going to be affected. And that, as I say, is what when we get caught in this vicious cycle, which is what we want to look at. So, what brings us into this vicious cycle? What styles of thinking? And these are some of the most common ones when it comes to looking at distorted negative thinking. We've already mentioned catastrophizing, imagining everything's going to go wrong. An analogy we quite often use is it's making a mountain out of a molehill. Yeah, so it's kind of like something small can happen, and we can kind of blow it up into being something quite big and quite frightening, and just always assuming that the worst is going to happen. And mind reading, and this happens a lot, particularly with anxiety. And it's something where we imagine, we know what someone else is thinking. We can tell, I can tell what they're thinking. I know what they're thinking about me. And of course, it's never positive. It's usually quite negative. But we develop this ability, or we think we develop this ability to be able to read what other people are thinking, what they're thinking about us. And of course, if there's already quite a negative narrative in there, these interpretations are going to be quite negative, and they're going to reinforce that narrative that might be going on. And personalizing, of course, this is where everything's my fault. You know, it's all my fault. You know, it's taking responsibility for things that aren't even, you know, that you're not responsible for, that you're not to blame for. And I mean, that can come quite often when we talk about low confidence levels, low self-esteem. It's you know, someone can, you know, accuse you of doing something and you've not done it. You'll take responsibility for it. And then obviously negative focus. I mentioned that earlier on, and that's very much about looking at, you know, if we're thinking of the past, so you're thinking back over the last 10 years, you'll only focus on the negative things that have happened. It's a bit like viewing the world, as it says here, through me spectacles. You know, focusing on your weaknesses rather than ignoring your strengths. Focusing on the bad things that have happened and discounting the good things that have happened. You know, remembering the bad relationship, but, you know, forgetting about perhaps one that was better. Remember, only focusing on that awful last job that you had, but forgetting perhaps about the one before that you really did enjoy. So it's that kind of distorted way of thinking, and we refer to it as negative focus. And then we have all or nothing thinking. That's black and white. You know, there's no grey areas. It's all or nothing. You know, it's 9 out of 10. You got an 8 out of 10 on a test. It's complete failure. You know, I didn't get a 10 out of 10. I got an 8. It's kind of not being able to see things in a balanced way. It's very much, you know, one extreme or the other. Black and white thinking. I'm a failure. It's pretty much all or nothing thinking, and these styles of thinking are some of the most common ones that someone who's experiencing anxiety and depression will start to experience. And of course, these styles of thinking are what takes us into what we're going to look at in a few minutes, which is the vicious cycle. And but this is where it starts. This is quite often where it starts, with the catastrophizing, the mind reading with a negative focus. And of course, when we're thinking like this, it's certainly going to start to affect how we are feeling, both emotionally and physically, and then go on to affect our behavior. So what events in life can get us thinking like this? And the one thing we can't do, and when we're delivering these courses at Mind, I will always say to people, unfortunately, we can't change the world around us. We can't change of external events that are to a large extent outside our control. You know, that's not something we're able to change. But what we can start to change is how we look at these things, how we approach these things, and how we think about these things. And, you know, obviously we could have slide after slide here of so many things that events in life that are outside our control, that, you know, that can happen to us. You know, moving to a new place where you don't know anyone, arguments with family, arguments with friends, a relationship breakup, you know, failing at something, redundancies at work, money problems. All of these things can be events that to a large extent are outside our control, but how we start to think about them is what takes us into this vicious cycle. And we just want to look at what that vicious cycle would start to form. So Alice, if we can just move on, brilliant. So here we have this vicious cycle that I've been mentioning. And you can notice at the top we've got our thoughts. To the left we've got emotions, we've got our physical feelings, and we've got our behaviour. And these are things that I've already mentioned. So let's look at an example of how this vicious cycle might form and how an individual might find themselves getting into this. So if we go back to the last slide and let's take redundancies at work. Redundancies at work. So someone turns up at work on a Monday morning and they stood in the canteen next to the drinks machine, colleagues around them. Another colleague comes in and says, have you heard there's going to be redundancies? That's obviously the last thing someone wants to hear first thing on a Monday morning. You know, on the way to work, you're thinking about the weekend, and maybe thinking about what you're going to do that evening. And suddenly your thoughts are completely changed. So on hearing that news, there's going to be redundancies. It's not unusual in that situation that a person may then start to think, it's going to be me. I'm going to be the one that gets made redundant. Where am I going to get another job? How am I going to pay the mortgage? How am I going to pay the bills? All this style of thinking can start. It's quite common, quite normal. Of course, those thoughts immediately are going to lead to an emotional change. So the thoughts of being made redundant, the thoughts of not being able to cope, not having enough money, that is going to make a person feel emotionally upset, anxious, angry, perhaps. You know, I can tell they wanted to get rid of me. I can tell that they were waiting for this chance. It's definitely going to be me. All these types of thoughts can lead to so many emotional changes and quite upsetting, extreme emotional changes. And of course, that's going to affect how we feel physically. So you can see how this cycle is starting to form. So obviously the physical feelings, having emotional thoughts, like the aforementioned, is going to lead to changes in how you're feeling physically. You know, palpitations, maybe feeling very, very tense, shaking, sweating, and behaviour. Behaviour is going to change without a doubt. You know, you might start to struggle to concentrate at work. A person may not be able to focus. They may go home that evening. They may start to maybe not want to answer the telephone, not want to talk to people. They may start being irritable with people at home around them if they live with other people. They could start to drink. They could turn to, you know, they could start to try just to, you know, forget about things, to stop thinking, because the thinking, of course, and how this cycle then starts to form is if you think, if this person is if they withdraw and they just want to be by themselves and they're sort of sat there sort of thinking, right, I don't want to talk to anyone, there's even more space for the catastrophizing, for the predictions, for the negative focus, for all of these styles of thinking to start to accelerate. And so this cycle will continue. So the more thoughts will become negative, the more person will become upset, the more they'll start to feel physically tense, and behaviour will become perhaps less helpful and keep them in this vicious cycle. So if we can just, I think there's another slide on this, Alice. Yeah, okay. So we're just looking here again at kind of what happens And it's very, very important for a person to be able to do, and what we teach and what we learn someone to do, is to be able to break out of this vicious cycle, because this cycle can form so quickly. I mean, if you look there at that situation where someone turns up at the canteen and work, and here's the news of redundancy, within minutes that cycle's formed. You know, within minutes they're having those thoughts, they're feeling as they're feeling, they're behaving as they're behaving. So these things can happen very, very quickly. But because they're so linked, the important thing to remember is, by changing one of them, we change the others. So if we can help a person to start to change how they think, that can break them out of that vicious cycle. If we can start to help a person to change how they're behaving and what they're doing, that will break the person out of this vicious cycle. And we're going to look at that later when Alice talks about the 5 ways to well-being. So things like physical exercise and actually more social interaction with other people, those things are really, really important in terms of breaking this vicious cycle, particularly if a person's become isolated and they're withdrawn from others as a result of how they're feeling and how they're thinking. So as you can see here, you know, how this kind of forms and how this kind of spins, you know, in terms of how a person's thinking. You know, nothing ever goes right, it's too much, how am I going to cope, it's all my fault, I can't be bothered. These are real common negative thoughts that can occur to people, and obviously the physical feelings there. These are very, very common ones that we work with all of the time. And the changes in the behaviour that I've mentioned: isolation, wanting to spend time alone, avoiding places, avoiding people, and it takes that person into, and it helps to keep them in this vicious cycle. So we need to be able to teach someone to break out of this. So in order to do this, it's very, very helpful if we can change how a person is thinking, and that's what we want to focus on here this morning. So we introduce here a 5-step program for challenging and negative thinking styles, and this is very, very effective. And it all starts with a piece of paper and a pen. And when we're working with someone, what we will always say is, it's very, very important to be able to get negative thoughts out and on paper as they occur. The analogy that I quite often use is, if you think of a sponge and you compare that sponge to our mind, you put that sponge on water, and as it starts to soak up the water and you don't squeeze out that sponge, what happens to it? It becomes heavier and heavier, and eventually it sinks. And that's kind of what happens to an individual. Unless we develop an ability to be able to squeeze out these negative thoughts, to kind of be able to challenge them, to be able to offer a counter narrative to what's going on, they build up, and eventually they will start to affect, we will start to get symptoms of anxiety and depression. So the 5 steps that we introduce people to, as I say, it starts with being able to write things down. So the first step is to label the thought. Now, that is basically writing it down. We call it labeling it because it's kind of like, you know, it's exposing it for what it is. It's a negative thought. And negative thoughts, ultimately, we can have a negative thought about anything, absolutely anything. And it is really only going to start to affect our emotions and how we feel physically, and certainly how we behave, if we actually believe it. If we're, you know, if we manage to actually convince ourselves that this is true, that will start to affect us. So the first thing to do is to look at what we're dealing with. What is the negative thought? And being able to write that down and look at it is something which is really, really important. And quite often, when you're working with someone and you look back at perhaps a few months down the line, when they've been practicing some of these techniques, and when they look back and they see some of the things that they used to write down, and some of the styles and some of the ways they used to think, it's like, wow, you know, I've come on so much, I've really, really changed. I can't believe I used to think like that. No wonder I was feeling how I was feeling, and no wonder I was doing what I was doing. So it all starts with, first of all, writing down, labeling, as it's referred to here, labeling the thought. That's just one of those bad thoughts, and in a sense, it starts to lose its power. Once it's taken out, written down on paper, it stops it going into the head. It stops it kind of being soaked up with all the others. The mind getting heavier and heavier and drying down. Get it out, put it on paper, and have a look. The next step, because obviously, that all sounds quite easy. The next one is to actually leave it alone. Take it, throw it in the bin. Turn your back, walk away from it. Turn your back on this negative thought. It's a negative thought. Walk away from it. Physically walk away from it. People, as I said, people get really, really work sometimes if they actually get the piece of paper that they've wrote it down, the label, scrunch it up, throw it in the bin, throw it away. Yeah? And for a lot of thoughts, that will work. But obviously there's 5 steps here. So some thoughts have been around a lot longer than that, particularly thoughts that refer to what we think about ourselves, how we feel about ourselves. And those are ones that take a little bit more work. And that's kind of why there's 5 steps here. So if that negative thought corner is coming back, if that negative thought is basically not happy to stay in the bin, no, I'm coming back. We need to move to step 3. And step 3 is basically where we have to be able to start to challenge this negative thought. Okay, so it's not just good enough to write it down, to leave it in the corner, to throw it in the bin. It's coming back. And an analogy we often use is a negative thought's a little bit like a bully. It will come back and it will challenge you. It will say you're not strong enough. It will say you're not good enough. It will say you're fail if you do something. It will say, it'll tell you things are going to go wrong. The thing there is to stand up to it as you would to a bully. And quite often when you stand up to a bully, we know what happens. They back off and they go elsewhere. And that's a really, really important technique to develop. And again, writing down here really is really, really important. So if you look at what you've wrote down in terms of the negative thought or something that's gone wrong, what about something that's gone right? If you wrote down someone who you've had an argument with that no longer likes you, what about someone who does like you? And it's being able to kind of write these things down actually helps us to see. A person tends to find that the power of their own handwriting is very, very, it's so personal. And reading and looking through these things really kind of can enforce positivity, because when you see the negative thought and next to it you see things that counteract that, something that went wrong, but here's a list of things that went right. And that helps us to challenge, as it mentions here, it helps us to challenge that bullying thought, that intrusive thought that keeps coming back, that won't go in the bin, that kind of keeps following us down the street. It's with us all the time. Developing a narrative to be able to challenge this is really, really important. And step 3 is about that. So basically being able to, when the bad thought says you can't do it, say I can. When the bad thought says you're not good enough, I am good enough. It's being able to develop that narrative that challenges these negative thoughts. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some of these thoughts may be around for quite some time. They may have been things that have occurred in formative years. Quite often, something that was said to us by a person who we looked up to at a particular point in our life, given something that was said by a parent, by a teacher, a friend in the playground. These formative years, things can go in there, and many, many years later, a person still believing that these things that have been said about them, and this narrative that has this internal narrative that has developed. So step 4 is all very much about thinking about what a person that cares about you, thinking about a person that loves you, what they would say. You were to sit down and actually say, look, I'm not good enough, everything I do goes wrong, I mess this up. They would be able to, because they can see the bigger picture, because they've got a more objective view, they'll be able to say, well, what about that? That went right. What about, when you didn't mess up there? What about this? They'll be able to offer that kind of counter narrative for you when quite often it's you can't see outside where that dark place a person might be at that particular moment. So thinking of what a person who cares about you, a friend, a partner, a parent, a child, That's really, really important. What would they say to you? Ask them. Yeah. And, you know, it's the chances are, as we know, they would disagree with that thought because they've been able to do that. Because when we're in that negative, that state of negative focus, we may only be able to see the more negative stuff, and we can't recall, we can't remember, we don't even want to perhaps, you know, consider more positive things that have happened. So let someone else be involved and let that person actually help you to see things differently. And step 5 is very much also looking at this involving another person in what's going on here. So imagine if you're someone that you care about, someone that you loved came to you and they said to you, you know, I think this, I don't think I'm good enough. I think everything goes wrong in my life. I don't think anything's ever going to go right in the future. What would you say to them? Because then you're in that position where you can see things objectively. You might say, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. What about this?" And you know, this worked out. You'd be able to see that, and you'd help them to be able to put their concerns and their worries into perspective. And another thing to consider as well is quite often we can get really caught up on thinking about something that we forget about in a few days' time, a few weeks' time. It's quite often, you know, when we're working with people, that's something that they will often say, you know, I was feeling quite upset yesterday, and you know, today I don't remember what I was thinking about, but I know I was thinking things that were making me feel anxious, and you know, led to me not wanting to leaving the house, and I really felt that sort of that vicious cycle forming yesterday. So being able to, you know, think about what it would be like if someone that you care about came to you and were saying these things, what would you say to them? You'd be able to give them things to challenge and to counteract those negative thoughts. And one other thing here is we all know someone who seems to handle problems very, very well. So, you know, this is someone at step 1. Immediately, they can label it. They can see a bad thought for what it is. It never gets any further than stage 1. It never gets internalized. Immediately, it's squeezed out. It's, you know, it's labeled. They may, you know, they don't have to get a pen out and write it down. And after practicing these techniques, you know, for a period of time, neither does anyone. But to start with, it's really, really worth practicing these things and writing these things down. After a while, it becomes automatic. And as I say, for some people, it is automatic. You know, they label that negative thought at the first stage. It never gets beyond that. What's so different about that person and you and me? What's so different? It's just that they think about things differently. They've got techniques that we can all learn to be able to challenge negative thoughts and never allow it to affect their emotions, and certainly not to affect their behavior. So practicing these 5 steps are really, really effective ways of being able to challenge negative thoughts. And if we can challenge negative thoughts, we change how we feel emotionally and physically, and we can change how we behave. So it's a really, really effective technique to learn and to put into practice. And as I say, after a while, you won't have to spend the rest of your life walking around with a notepad and a pen. It's not like that. You will learn these techniques and you will be able to do them, practice them automatically. That's a negative thought. That's, you know, challenge it if it's still around after a few minutes. This will come naturally. So practice these techniques. It's really, really effective way to challenge negative thoughts and to stop us going into that vicious cycle. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, also, you know, in this vicious cycle, it's not just by changing how we think, also by changing what we do. That's another way to break it. And Alice is going to talk about the 5 ways to well-being now. And this is really all about you know, looking at things that we can do, how we can bring around changes in our behavior, and in turn how that will affect how we're feeling and how we're thinking. So I will hand over to my colleague Alice, and she'll talk about the 5 ways to wellbeing.
Thank you, Neil. So looking more at behaviour on the vicious circle, first of all, I want to have a look at connect. So taking time out just to talk to others, that can really help us connect. It's really good for our well-being and the person we're talking to's well-being as well. So during COVID-19, it's been more difficult to connect with people. But just using the phone or going on Skype or Zoom and just taking 5 minutes out and just asking a friend, how are you doing? How's your head? It can make a massive difference to everybody's well-being. And it really links in nicely as well to the negative thoughts that Neil was talking about, in terms of when we are worrying about different things, getting different people's opinions on that problem, and just keep talking. It's been proven to be brilliant for our well-being. Exercise is also really important in terms of the 5 ways to well-being. So we've got be active. So it might be linking this in with connect. We might go for a walk with a friend. Regular physical activity is associated with lower rates of depression and anxiety across all age groups. It increases our endorphin levels. So it doesn't have to be something massive just to give us that boost that we need during the day. It might be walking up the stairs. It might be putting our music on the headphones and hoovering the house. It might be doing an exercise app on YouTube, going for a walk in the park. There's lots of things we can do just to give us that boost of the endorphins. I know myself, after a stressful day at work, it's great. Just put the dogs on the lead, go out, clear your head, have a walk, come back, feel better, feel like you've ended your day. And whilst we're doing our walks, the next area I want to have a look at is take notice. So being aware of what is taking place in the present directly enhances our well-being. So when we're out walking, we're looking and noticing about what's around us, looking at the nature, the wildlife around us, and just noticing new things and taking time out to be there, not thinking about what's happened yesterday or what we're doing next week, just kind of enjoying the moment. And I've been talking to a lot of service users at Rochdale Mind. Obviously they live local in Rochdale, around different areas like the canal, and people have said, so while they've been working at home or they've been off at home on furlough, they've gone out for walks and they've just noticed all these different places that they can get to from the house that they didn't know before, and just really gorgeous different areas of the canal that they've just never taken notice of before. So that's a real positive. The next area I want to have a look at is keep learning. So in terms of staying in the moment, this can be done through learning. So it might be something little like doing a crossword, researching something on Google, something that we've always wanted to know about, or even reading a book. But all of this helps us stay focused on the moment and helps move our head into a different place. So we could surround ourselves with beaches of Australia or different holiday destinations, but we're taking ourselves away, a bit of escapism for a while. The last area I want to have a look at is give. So individuals report a greater interest in helping others are more likely to rate themselves as happy. Regular acts of kindness directly links to improved well-being. So I've got a little story at the beginning of lockdown. One of my service users who was shielding at home, and she always likes to have a cup of tea in the morning like most of us do. That day she'd run out of tea bags. She was on the phone to her friend. She said, I'm not feeling good today, I've not had my cup of tea. I'm not feeling good anyway, but this is pushing me over the edge. Half an hour later, there's a knock at the door and there's a box of tea bags and a packet of biscuits on the doorstep, and her friend's at the end of the drive with a big smile on her face. It's given them both, enhanced both their well-beings, the friend for helping and the lady for getting a cup of tea. I'm going to end today's session just by giving you some contacts for Rochdale Mind. So you've got our phone number on there, the web address. if anybody did want to do a self-referral, I wanted to do a referral from someone else, the self-referral forms are online, or you can ring the number if you need some support having the application form filled out. Put my email address on there and Neil's email address if you have got any questions. And I hope you found today's session useful. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.